Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first ever Lit in Colour teacher conference held in partnership with TES. This event is being filmed live, and therefore, if there are any technical problems or disconnections, we will be back as soon as possible. My name is Zahida Nabagarika. I'm Senior Lit in Colour Manager at Penguin Books, and I'm joined by Leslie Nelson Addy, Education Manager at Runnymede Trust. The Lit in Colour campaign was founded between Penguin Books and the Runnymede Trust in 2020 with the aim of supporting UK primary and secondary schools to make the teaching of English literature more inclusive of writers of colour. The first phase of the campaign involved commissioning research with an independent team based at Oxford University's Department of Education, investigating the barriers which currently prevent more books by writers of colour from being taught in the classroom in England. This research found that the key barriers for teachers include a lack of resources, budget, and time, as well as a lack of confidence and knowledge in knowing how to talk about race in the classroom. Overall, this results in a systemic underrepresentation of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic writers in the curriculum that is relative to both their place in contemporary British literary excellence, but also compared to the demographics of the UK classroom.
Since then, Lit in Colour has been focused on bringing together different organisations across the educational sector to help facilitate meaningful change. We want to give direct support to schools and teachers with practical, inspirational, and effective tools and resources. This conference is all about building teacher confidence to talk about what it means to consciously engage with text by writers of colour in the classroom. We will begin with the secondary reflective panel discussion, followed by an in conversation with novelist Bernardine Evaristo and playwright Tanika Gupta. This afternoon, we have a primary reflective panel discussion, followed by an in conversation with novelist Nazneen Ahmed Patuk. Please remember to join the link to the primary session after the break. There will be opportunities to ask questions, so please use the chat function. After each session, a QR code will be shown on screen. Please scan it and enter all your details for a chance to win one of our book bundles. Please also share your thoughts and comments on social media using the hashtag LIC Teacher Conference and tag us at TES for Teachers and at Penguin UK Books. I'm now going to hand over to Lynette Carr-Armstrong, who is the chair for the secondary reflective panel session. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lynette Carr-Armstrong, and really looking forward to this session this morning. So welcome to you all. I just want to, just say a little bit about myself. I am a teacher in long-standing English teacher, and I've also worked in advisory and consultancy, Ofsted, that kind of thing. So for many years, and I'm very passionate, obviously, about literature, and in particular literature of diverse cultures. So let's just talk about what this session will be about this morning. The main aim of this reflective session is to explore the internal and external barriers a range of English teachers and leaders have faced and overcome in order to incorporate more texts written by authors of colour in their classrooms and curriculums. Our panelists will share contextual detail about their professional journeys, their schools, as well as the process and their reflections on how they made these changes and the impact these changes have had. So, I would like to introduce you to our panelists, and I'm just going to ask each of them to come in and just say a little bit about themselves. So maybe kick off with Joy.
Morning, everybody. My name is Joy Mbakwe. I am an assistant head teacher at Lillian Baylis Technology College, assistant head teacher for community and culture. If you want to follow me, I am at Miss Mbakwe, Miss Joy Mbakwe on Instagram. Thanks.
Jessica?
Morning, everyone. My name's Jess Tacon. I'm Deputy Head of English at a school in North London. I lead the Right Writing campaign. And if anyone did want to follow me on Instagram as well, I'm at The Right Writing.
And Aisha?
Morning, I'm Aisha Rao. I'm a secondary English teacher at Windsor High School in sixth form in Dudley. And I'm also a member of the NATE Reviewing Literature group, who a few of you are on here today. So, yeah.
Thank you all. And we want this session to be really interactive. So please don't forget to put any additional questions in the chat that we'll come to in the second half. But I'm going to kick off with a question that I'm going to pose to you all. I'm going to ask you to really just share a little bit about your journey engaging with text by authors of colour. And just an additional thing there, was this something you started doing more recently, or something that's gone on throughout your career? And again, just, jump in whenever you feel.
I don't mind starting with this one. So it's actually something that I've been doing since my training year, I would say. And when I was planning sort of for this session, thinking about the questions, I actually remembered that my ITT interview for the interview for my PGC, I actually did like a lesson that was on Langston Hughes and like Kanye West. That might not be as like relevant or like maybe appropriate now actually thinking about it, but like I use some of his lyrics. So that's sort of teaching that I've always been interested in, and it's something that I've done for a long time, because that's the kind of, I suppose, literature and that's always the sort of things that I found with students as well. When I started teaching the classroom in my training year, got the best responses, was the most engaging. So yeah, it's something that I've done for a long time, and always found really important. So it's always been on my agenda, if you like, and particularly being teaching as widely as possible within curriculum constraints is something that I'm really passionate about, because I think sometimes, and I know a lot of what this will come up later, the curriculum can be really restrictive. So something that I like basically is things that I like to read, things that like popular culture, lots of popular culture. I tend to use a lot of that with teaching English. I think it's one of the best subjects for it. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Ladies?
So I think I would say that I began my teaching career in what I would deem an institutionally racist school. And in being a school like that as a young Black woman, I definitely felt myself performing in the classroom, performing well, but also performing what I believed could be deemed as professional. I spent a long time distancing myself from very obvious characteristics. So I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I was very young at the time, but I spent a long time trying to distance myself from that. So speaking in a particular way, trying to dress in a particular way. And I found that even though I was doing all of those things, I was still kind of coming up short and experiencing microaggressions anyway, being passed over for promotions. In that school, there weren't any opportunities, there weren't any texts by authors of color, but I was asked to design a scheme of work called Telling Tales. I don't know if you've heard of it, by the AQA Anthology. And in there, there's a short story called The Invisible Mass at the Black Grove. And it speaks about this girl who's coming over from Jamaica. And I remember reading that story and just being issues like featureism, texturism, colorism just leaping out at me. And at the time, I hadn't taught A-level. I was just an NQT. So I didn't know that I was reading the text through a post-colonial lens. I didn't know I was reading it through my own personal experiences of these things. But when I designed the schemes of work and then it was shared across the department, I realized that I was speaking to something that no one else could speak to. Not that they didn't want to, but they couldn't because they just didn't have the eyes that I had. So I left that school eventually and I became 2IC at another school. And it's 2020 at this point and George Floyd is murdered. And I don't want to go and protest. I don't want to be on social media because everywhere I turn, I'm reminded of the insignificance of Black lives. And I'm triggered, for lack of a better word. I just can't cope. But my students are looking to me for the answers, because online lessons were excruciating. They were really, really hard. But I'm trying to teach about a text that has nothing to do with the world essentially crumbling around them. And I think it's in that moment that I pivoted. I stopped being someone who was shying away from being a Black woman, and I began to use my lessons as an opportunity to teach them about what it meant to live in my shoes, and actually what it meant to live in theirs also. And then I became head of department that year, and the basis of my appointment was to overhaul the curriculum in a sense and really try and make it anti-racist. And so my appointment was, I was given the job based on my mission, essentially, and that's kind of been my journey from distancing to being really embracing this kind of work.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Jessica?
So I trained to be a teacher about 10 years ago now, and in my training it felt very traditional, very canonical. Like it wasn't diverse, it wasn't representative at all, really. And it wasn't until I started teaching in an inner London school about 5 years ago that it became really obvious to me how much was missing in the curriculums, on the exam board specifications, because I'd look at, and this was when, I was just a classroom teacher. I didn't actually have any say in what I was teaching, to be honest. So I'd look at what I was being told to teach, I'd look at the students in front of me, and it wasn't matching up. So that's when, for me, I started not pushing back, but prioritizing a bit more, like making sure that we were serving the next generation, essentially, part of that being the students that were in front of us in the classroom.
Thank you. I mean, it's such a range of experience there. And I do think that, when I think back to the beginning of my career, which started in the sort of early to mid 90s, I think it was a time where there were lots of opportunities, really. And I think it does depend on the context of your school. I mean, I was very lucky to train at a school that had a Black head teacher, and was just a very forward thinking school, really, and very open to, enthusiastic people like myself who wanted to bring everything. And I think there is that, it can seem very constraining, but I think that we do have to carve a path and really think about the things that we want our young people to know. So thank you for that. And I'm going to just move on to our next question. And I'm going to direct this really at Jessica and Aisha. How did you feel when you first started teaching texts written by authors of colour in the classroom?
Do you want to go, Jess, or shall I?
You go first, Aisha.
Yeah, okay.
And I'll add on.
I'll let you argue it out.
Yeah. So, I think I had some confidence, I think, because, like I said, it is something that I've done from day one. But also, I think that in terms of how I felt, I think that confidence came from being a person of colour, I think, being a teacher of colour. And I was always really conscious of my identity as a South Asian English teacher, which is still, rare, I think, particularly in this subject, like, in English as a subject, not just teaching more generally, but I think in that particular subject area, teachers of colour are more rare, I think, in English than other subjects. I know that's something that actually Lit in Colour, the report, even looked at, that, teachers of colour in terms of subject area is quite an interesting thing to think about in itself. So I know I can't speak, although, I had that confidence, so I can't speak from all experience. My experience was particular to me, being, Asian and female. But I also think one of the things, I suppose, with when I started teaching at the school I'm currently at, which I started at about 5 years ago, in the area of Dudley that I live in, that has a particularly strong, the regional aspect was really important there in terms of that confidence. And like Jess actually just said, serving the community that the school was in. So the school I'm in currently we have a really high Yemeni Arabic population in the local area. It's actually one of the highest in the Midlands. So the sorts of texts and authors that I kind of researched or read about tended to be Muslim or Arabic. So I found some local poets who were from that background. And I'd kind of seek out texts that sort of reflected those students and kind of made them, feel like that they were seen, and that kind of felt quite important to do that in particular as well. And that kind of, I suppose, fed into that confidence further. So that's something I would say in terms of how I started. When I started teaching authors of colour. But again, I would say that is within curriculum constraints. There aren't any of those on our curriculum, so that is as and when I could fit it in. That was me in my own classroom, so that wasn't like it wasn't a sort of departmental thing.
So I'll just add on to that. I think I'll speak here about when I first started teaching entire texts by authors of colour, so like entire poetry collections, entire novels, entire plays, because I think for a long time when we talk about racial representation, it's often just been like poems and poetry collections. And this is something, Joy, that you sort of mentioned earlier with the telling tales, I think was short stories, wasn't it? But and obviously just reading one poem like that's not like an in-depth look at something, is it? So I think when I first started really in-depth teaching of authors of colour, as I said earlier, I was in a very racially diverse school. I still am. I think there was, and this is something we hear a lot, I think for me there was a bit of a fear that, because I care about the students I'm teaching, a fear that I was going to misrepresent, or I was going to say the wrong thing, or I was going to harm them in some way. But then that fear is then, and Aisha just spoke about, serving the community you're teaching. That fear then was for me taken over by a necessity to I guess serve the students that I'm teaching. And that's not to say that race is the only way that we engage with text and we relate to each other. But if you're ignoring certain racial identities, you're definitely communicating the message to those students that certain races are bad or should be marginalized. And that's in any classroom. That's not just in, a racially diverse classroom. And I'd say with regards to that fear that teachers can feel, and I felt that as well, that nothing is perfect when you start doing something properly. That doesn't mean that you just go with the flow and see what happens. Obviously, we're teachers, we plan ahead. But I think as long as you're going in with kindness and understanding, and I suppose as well like a willingness to give up some of your power as an educator, then that fear just dissipates, and it's replaced with that feeling that like, yeah, I am actually doing my job, and I'm making these children in front of me feel celebrated and feel like they matter and feel seen and feel like that English as a subject is a place for them. And obviously that links to so many things like Aisha just said with teachers as well, and like the teacher workforce. So
Thank you. I think that question starts to really feed into one of the things that I did want to ask you about was about actually the themes of teaching racism. And what I'm going to do is, because I think you started to sort of touch on that, so I'm going to go to Joy, and I'm going to really ask you, Joy, about how you can really overcome the challenges of teaching about race and racism, and what sort of challenges you perhaps have faced. And again, in your introduction, you started to talk in our first question, you did start to talk about that, but I'd be interested to hear and then circle back to the others.
Sure. I think the first kind of challenge that I face is that I'm not a bystander. This isn't an issue that isn't intimately connected to my identity. When I'm in staff training, because my staff is my school body are doing so much to try and just kind of get on board with what's happening around the world and make sure that we're all seen. But there are moments where they speak about how difficult it is for Black women to achieve. And I'm sitting there thinking, Do they know that they're speaking about me and my life? And I, in a professional setting, do not want to be confronted with the realities and all the barriers I've had to overcome. I think that if you're in a personal setting and you're speaking about race relations, you can lament, you can grieve with fellow people that look like you. But these children, some of them look like me, some of them don't. But my words carry weight, they have consequence. So I must be measured, I must be balanced. I can't allow something so personal that is being explored in a professional sense, in a professional place, to be, mishandled by me. I think the second challenge is the tenderness with which it needs to be handled as well. It's not just my life; it's their lives as well. I remember when I was teaching Sign of the Four, one of my students, a black boy, said to me, "Miss, why is the only person of color in the text shot and killed without speaking?" And George Floyd has just been murdered. So he's asking me, "Miss, why do I have to be reminded in such an aggressive way in the classroom that you say is safe by you, a black woman, that I don't really matter?" What do I say to that? How do I tenderly make sure that this young man isn't harmed further by my teaching of this text? And the last thing that I think, the last challenge that I think kind of came up for me was this innocence that's lost. I am their teacher. I love my students dearly. I don't want to rid them of this innocence that comes with understanding the injustices that plague the world. You want to shield your children from from the monsters that are out under the bed. And here I am saying, hey, this is what it means to be black. This is what it means to live in our society. There is that loss that I'm taking from them. And even though I'm giving them the language to empower, I'm giving them the language to speak about their experiences, because even though I may feel as though I'm ridding them of their innocence, my children have been in institutions that have not acknowledged them appropriately since they were children, since they were primary school. I remember I asked my students, when did you realize that you couldn't use slang in the classroom? When did you realize that the way that you spoke was something that was for there and not for here? And you had to kind of censor yourself here. And they said, "Miss, I don't know, primary school?" And I said, okay, this has been happening for a long time. So yes, I'm empowering them, but I'm giving them the language, but I'm also ridding them of that innocence that I don't want to do. In terms of overcoming it, a few things. I think vulnerability and honesty, as you can probably tell, I do speak very from the places that I've experienced. I try not to distance myself from them, and I speak honestly about what it means to live in my shoes, what it means to live in this world. Um, a willingness to listen. I think, Jessica, you touched on this as well. I think that sometimes as teachers, we can be quite prideful. We teach from the highest place of authority, so we believe that we have all the answers. But I have never been stopped and searched by the police, but my children have, my students have. So when they speak about that, I must become the listener. I must allow them to speak about what that means in a way that doesn't mean I can't end the conversation when I'm ready and say, and this is the lesson that we've learned. I can't do that. You teach me. And I guess that's linked to my final point, which is I think it's really important to learn about when you are facilitator, when you're teacher, and when you're learner, and you're moving between those. Sometimes you sit back, I'm here to learn. Sometimes I'm here to facilitate. What do you think? What do you think? And sometimes I'm bringing it all together and saying, this is the lesson that we can this is how we move forward. And I think those are the kind of challenges, and that's how I've overcome them.
Thank you. And ladies, I don't know if you wanted to come in there and just really kind of comment about, how you would approach teaching race, building on what sort of Joy has said there. Does any of that resonate as something that is being shared or that comes from you?
I think Joy's put it pretty eloquently, to be honest. I don't know what I'd add. I would just say, just that like what you said at the end, Joy, about considering what your role is. Is it, what did you say? Facilitator, teacher, listener, and marrying that up with, okay, who's in front of me in the classroom? What am I teaching? What narrative is being presented here? How do I make sure that what is being taught and the way I'm teaching it is not harming these students? It's just a lot of consideration. It's a lot of consideration and planning ahead, not just like if you know that, say, okay, today we're going to get to this chapter in this book where this potentially like traumatic event happens, say, and it's to do with racism, like planning ahead, not just going in and thinking, oh, I'll see how it goes, like thinking, how am I going to be considerate about this, and how am I going to make sure those students feel safe? And like you said, Joy, that they feel, your students obviously feel able to talk to you and question you and be open with you. Like, how am I going to make sure that they feel able to do that in the classroom?
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say it's been covered really well, actually, the answer to the question already. I think almost on the reverse side, so as well as with engaging students and responding to students' questions when they have them, I think something that it's not actually something that I have an answer to. It's probably a question that I'm throwing back. Is that I've kind of had, I suppose, the challenge that I've had is when some students can become really reserved and inward, and I think they can almost lose confidence, and there's a lot of worry that they might say the wrong thing. I think when race is brought up in the classroom, and maybe it might depend on obviously where you're teaching or what kind of students you've got, who you've got in front of you. But that's something that I've noticed as well with classes is, and again, I don't know, I'm kind of asking this back to you all, but how to overcome that. I think with creating that safe space obviously is a starting point, but I think sometimes students can get very almost like, I suppose, not contribute, or kind of maybe turn a bit inward, and because they're worried about saying the wrong thing in those discussions as well. So I think I suppose that's something I'm still working on, actually, just thinking about how to overcome that for those students. So I don't know if anyone's got anything to say on that actually as a solution, because that's still something that I'm not as sure about myself.
I think it is about, creating an environment where, everybody feels that they can input, that there are kind of some ground rules, but that, you're really interested in what everybody has to say, and everybody, there's no intention to offend. It's really about exploring so that you can learn. And I think as a teacher, you do have to be able to, you know, ask the questions and create the space for people to come in and, direct the questions in such a way so that it isn't so loaded, and it is at their, where they're at, but drawing them to where, will be a better place to be. And I definitely think that, that actually focusing on cultural aspects as well is really important, because it's not, to focus on uh, racism is negative, and it's very stressful, and it can be very stressful for everybody, and it also pigeonholes people who experience racism, that is their only experience and the only thing that defines who they are, where they come from, where those characters might come from. And I think that we need to spend more time looking at other aspects of what it is to be black, or a person of color, or from a different culture, and the richness that brings, whether it is through language or through practices, all of those sorts of things. So I think that is the work that we have to do as teachers. And I was going to ask Jessica, really, just again in terms of like how you build confidence in being able to teach and introduce these kinds of aspects into the classroom and with students.
I mean, this is going to be shocking from an English teacher, but read a lot and research a lot. And I think the more that all teachers are doing this, genuinely doing it, the less we'll have the need to explicitly discuss books by authors of colour as if they're separate from literature on a wider level. And when I say read, I don't just mean, the text that we're going to teach. This has been mentioned a lot already, but really considering how are you going to teach those texts to the students in your classes. And I know that, for example, the Runnymede Trust, I know that, and Leslie, you'll have to correct me if I get the title of this wrong, but they have a document which is called Race and Racism in English Secondary Schools. Did I get that right? And for example, that looks at more of like a school-wide level. And I think documents like that are really important to consider the bigger picture, I guess, of what we're teaching, because sometimes we can get, as teachers, we have so many things that we're told to focus on, from Ofsted, SLT, school priorities, and it can be a lot. So just, I think we don't have a lot of time. Teachers are very time poor, but really carving out the time where you can to read up and to come back to that word consideration, consider how you're best going to teach the texts. And yeah, I guess I just finished by saying that the only thing that you change should not be the texts on your curriculum. Because that's a part of it. If you're just doing that, you're just shoehorning in something different. You're not actually embedding it and making sure that that it's purposeful, and that it helps the students that you're teaching.
Thank you for that. I'm going to just move us on a little bit, and I'm going to ask Aisha a question here, just about what other resources you have used to make your learning and teaching around diverse authors and cultures more effective and inspirational.
So much. So this like leads on nicely from Jess's, actually, because like one of them is read widely. So reading is one of the things that I've done, obviously, and obviously reading writers from diverse backgrounds is one of the things. I think specifically teaching about making like teaching and learning inspirational and effective. One of the things I did want to touch on was school visits, actually, and from just thinking about the end of this year, the academic year we've just had at school, we had a visit at my school from Suhaima Manzoor Khan, who was brilliant. So again, if you haven't read she's a poet. She's Muslim, wears a hijab. She was, again, thinking about my particular demographic at our school. It was absolutely incredible to have her in school. And what was again particularly inspirational about this visit that we had, and we were very lucky to be able to do that. Again, budgets and things come into that, because those things can be expensive to have author visits, but author visits is such a great way of making this inspirational, is actually to hear from these writers, or hearing from writers of color. And we were really lucky in that we were able to, we targeted students. We made it for girls only in year 10, which we thought was really important, because girls, we sort of wanted it to be like a confidence for the girls sort of thing, and we actually targeted the students that we got English teachers to nominate the students that they wanted to put forward for the visit. She did a workshop with them, a creative workshop, and when we had the girls in the room and I gave them a little invite to tell them, this is what you've been invited to, this is who's coming, and they were, two of the girls in my classroom sat right by my desk were like, she's Muslim, like straight away. Like two of the girls who again wear hijabs themselves, and that's what it's all about. That was so important. They were so and it wasn't just Muslim girls that went, it was the whole English department nominated their year 10 girls from their year 10 classes, and we had a real mix. But it was really important for those girls, I think, in particular, to have her come in. And she's a really powerful speaker. She's an educator as well. She's very radical, and I think that's great. She's very outspoken, and that's so important for those girls, actually. So one thing I would say is actually, school visits, target students, that can be so inspirational and so powerful. So that was just from personal experience more recently. Also making the learning, you could, cross curricular. So you could look at, making ties in with like history. That's, your other departments are a great resource. So, finding out or observing your history colleagues, how do they teach empire? If you're not confident, you could definitely go and do that. That's something that I've done before. I've even found out in the last couple of years that actually, I think it's A-level PE or some aspect, a qualification on PE, I've forgotten. They teach about empire in PE. So for one of their, I think it's the A-level, but don't quote me on that because I'm not an expert. So they even, you could ask actually other subject areas. They do actually cover these things. So it's worth finding out. And then you can maybe make those connections with students as well who, in other subjects. I also think, again, using popular culture, that's one of my like big things. So I love using Stormzy. He's one of my absolute favourite people. So I tend to, he pops up in my lessons a lot. And picture books that connect. So picture books are a great way in actually to a lot of topics. There's lots of picture books on that are very, very powerful that you can use. There's actually one that I've got called The Roots of Rap, which I've used before, that tells the history of sort of rap and hip hop, where it started in New York, and that's a great one for introducing like African American poetry. So yeah, there's so much out there. Attend lots of CPD, the Globe do anti-racist Shakespeare CPD, the British Library, Nate as well obviously do lots of CPD. Lit Drive, lots of them provide new ways of teaching old texts actually. And actually the Nate group that Jess and Leslie and I are part of, we're developing a teacher resource as well, that is going to have, for further nonfiction reading, it's going to have a whole list of recommended nonfiction reading for teachers. So look out for that. That'll be coming soon. So yeah, I feel like I've thrown a lot out there, and I think that wasn't too much, but yeah, I've just there's
thank
loads.
you. That's fantastic. I hope you've all got your pens at the ready and have been noting all of that down. I'm going to ask Joy to sort of expand on that in some ways, but just think about non-fiction texts, interesting non-fiction texts you've read to develop your own practice, and what impact did these texts have on your knowledge and understanding of race-related issues? And obviously you've talked about sort of George Floyd already, so just kind of if you could sort of share that and give people more things to note down.
Sure, of course. Before I respond to that question, actually, you posed a question that was really kind of like resonated with me about how do I respond to students who become inward and reserved. And I think it's something that I've also observed in staff. And I know some of you who are attending this conference actually are going back to schools that perhaps you have that tendency, or you observe it in staff when you do want to speak about these things. People don't outwardly say that they're not in favor of it, but you sense that the mood in the room shifts. And I just thought I'd give some kind of tips as to how to kind of do that in the classroom and in these kind of CPD training. I think the first thing you want to do is kind of make sure you're planning any questions you want to explore, planning those ahead. Make sure you're doing that. Break off into small groups where possible. People are really shy to speak about. They're really scared of saying the wrong thing, and it's understandable. Racism is a really kind of like word that's quite stigmatized. So small groups, paired work, and students and teachers alike, split them up, give them opportunities to explore these questions that you've thought about. If you can have kind of groups that are more aligned, so maybe you can pair people together, maybe someone who's a bit more talkative than somebody else. Circulate the room if you can, and then spotlight. And that way you would have given them the confidence to have been able to kind of talk about, build their confidence with the person they're kind of peer. And then when you spotlight that, you give them the opportunity to begin to build their confidence out loud. And I think these kind of things are things I just thought about really quickly that I think can help in the classroom and in your staff CPD. Sorry, to answer your question that you actually posed. The first book I read a book this summer actually, and it's called The Pain We Carry, and it was recommended to me by one of the people that I line manage. It's a book that I didn't know that I needed to read. I, in some ways, had become quite tired of talking about race, not because it doesn't matter, but because it is so heavy. And there are moments in the text that she speaks about. It's called The Pain We Carry. Sorry, I don't know if I mentioned that. And she speaks about the way that race informs everything. And I think as a person of color, I'm often accused of playing the race card. I don't know what the race card is, but when I say it, you all kind of know, what I'm talking about. Like, as though, you're almost afraid to say, this is my experience, because you're afraid of the institution and the people within it. But The Pain We Carry talks about the way that, potentially my father, as an immigrant, as a refugee, as someone who survived the war, has come over to this country, how he's had to navigate the 1970s Britain, and that pain, that trauma of going through that experience has informed the way that he reared me, and how I now carry that. And what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my classroom? And I think in reading that book, it's given me an empathy that I didn't have for myself, and an empathy that I can now carry into the classroom for my students and their parents. What does it mean when you have parents who don't look like you, who may not be able to speak to you in the language that they're struggling to comprehend? They want their child to do well, but they don't know where to begin. What can I give them? How can I extend that empathy that I now have for myself and my father? That's the first book. The second book is called White Fragility. I think it's quite well known. I think at times people are more offended about being called a racist than racism itself. And I think this book is really good and quite powerful in the sense that it allows you to understand that being kind or being good and being racist are not mutually exclusive. You can be a good person and be racist. You can be kind to people and still be racist. And it's really important that we begin to understand that until we begin to unpick and unpack what has been handed to us, i.e., our perceptions of what is beauty, what does it mean to be able, what does it mean to be intelligent, what does it mean to be beautiful? All of these things are ideas that have been handed to us. We need to unpack these things, and I think white fragility allows us to center, the work that needs to be done, as opposed to the tenderness and the fragility that often arises when we speak about racism. So those are the two books that I've read that have kind of allowed me to continue on with the work I'm doing.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to ask Aisha and Jessica. And again, there's so many overlaps in what we're talking about today, but it's just to drill down a little bit. So there is often an expectation that the literature written by authors of colour ought to be positive, uplifting, to challenge the more common narrative of suffering. Now, I've said that I do think that it is important to have that balance. What is your perspective on this, and how do you ensure the learning and teaching of text by authors of colour have a sense of hope and optimism, while at the same time addressing themes like racism, trauma, and oppression?
You want me
Aisha?
to go, Aisha?
Yeah,
You
you
go,
go. Go
Aisha.
on. Yeah. Are you
Okay.
sure? Go on.
Yeah,
You go.
you go first.
Okay. So I would say it is about balance. I think it is all about balance with this. It's a difficult question. I think it's one that comes up a lot in these conversations, and it's completely understandable as well, because what I would say is that a lot of YA young adult fiction, it is actually issues focused. They are very issues focused anyway. And believe it or not, that is often a lot of what students do want to read about. Lots of YA fiction is classically very kind of issues focused and deals with that, this kind of coming of age thing. So I would start with that. I'd also say that the humour market is growing. I think there's lots of texts by writers of colour now, and books by writers of colour that are like very humorous. So I've read a few recently that are much kind of funnier, and they're kind of that area of that market with writers of colour but writing funny books, that's also growing. So it's worth looking into that. And you could that's part of that balance, having those texts in your library, recommending those texts to kids, not always having, I suppose they might not necessarily be on your curriculum, they might not be literary, the funny texts in that sense in terms of studying, but that's definitely part of that balance, I think. And I think when maybe teaching texts, I suppose, that are maybe like we've said, traumatic or on these quite difficult themes, so addressing those themes but also instilling that sense of hope and optimism, it's making it with your teaching maybe more solutions focused, looking to a more hopeful future. So what could you offer in terms of a solution to it? It's hard because we're talking really broadly here rather than about a particular text, but how could we look to a more hopeful future? And one example that I would use, it's not one that I've taught, but it's one that I read just a couple of months ago for the Cheltenham Festival panel, which I'm on. And it's called The Roles We Play by Saba Khan. It's a graphic novel. They are going to be using it so Cheltenham Festival use it for Key Stage 3, actually. It is very, it's about sort of second, third generation immigrant trauma. It's about, she's writing, it's autobiographical essentially, Saba Khan's kind of upbringing in a South Asian Muslim household in Britain, but she writes about the kind of trauma and that kind of really heavy shadow of empire. It's a fantastic graphic novel. I would recommend it to anyone. It really connected with me. And it is going to be used in schools. And what I would say on one thing is it ends hopefully. It ends on a real moment of hope, which is great. It is very she does talk about moments of depression. She's an architect, so going to university, going into that very male dominated kind of industry. She writes about that, getting into university, these kind of really white institutions. All of that is in there, and that's something that I related with a lot. What I would say with that graphic novel is that it's a book that I wish I'd read when I was a teenager, and it's one that I've since recommended to my sisters, and it's one that I found really, really powerful. So I wish I'd read that at that age. And so what I would say is that I would have felt really seen reading that at that age. So yes, Ensure Hope and Optimism, it is a book that ends hopefully, but don't underestimate what an acknowledgement of a struggle can do as well, because that was her struggle, and that would have really like spoken to me, I think, at that age. So yes, it is very traumatic in a way, that story, but that acknowledgement of that struggle would have meant a lot to me then as well. So it is about balance. I think there's two sides to that. Definitely. So the acknowledgement of the struggle is important as well. I hope that it's a difficult question to answer, so I'm gonna stop there. I hope that's yeah. Thank you.
Jessica?
Yeah, I can add on. I mean, I think you've put that really well, Aisha, and it is a difficult question. I think a lot of what we're talking about with this question is diversity, I guess, which I don't always love that word, because I think it can be used in a very like tokenistic way. But if we're talking about diversity, diverse narratives, diversity literally means varied. It means a variety. And we are teaching any writer, but we're teaching authors of colour to move away from them being marginalised, which historically has happened and is still happening now. But if we don't show balanced narratives, as Aisha has just said, within that, I guess we're just misrepresenting rather than underrepresenting in a way. And no group is a monolith, if you like. The only thing that authors of colour have in common is that they are not white. So if, say, we're talking in terms of curriculum, as has been mentioned quite a lot, we need to look in a bigger picture sort of way. We need to look in its entirety at the narratives that we are presenting, and as Aisha has already said and given some great examples there, making sure that it is varied and making sure that it is not just one thing that we're showing students.
I completely agree. I think that that there is such a range. And I think, yes, we have a national curriculum and all of those sorts of things, but I still think within that you can constrain yourself as a teacher, really, and use that as something that constrains you. And actually, there is, a lot of flex. I've never felt there isn't, when I've been teaching and working with teachers, I just feel that, the ceiling is, it's just not there. There is a lot that I can actually do, and it is about really sort of understanding that we do have an opportunity to expand the horizons of young people. And I'm going to ask Joy really how you bring parents on board with that. So this question is really about how parents and students have contributed to your learning and teaching of text written by authors of colour.
Sure. So students have always been at the heart of everything that I've sought to do. Questions I ask myself are, why this text? Why now at this point in their lives? And why them? And I think there was a point at which my 2IC, when I was head of department, wanted to teach our students like some gothic genre, a kind of a text. And I kept asking her, like, why? Why them? Why do they need to know this? Does it prepare them for the GCSE? What does it do for these particular students? And eventually she began to understand that ultimately we are here to serve the students in front of us. And I teach in a Black majority school, so that informs what I do. But I do think that even if you work in a white majority school or whatever majority school, you still need to prepare them to be citizens of the world. So if you are faced with students who are all white, they still need to understand what it means to be, I guess the word diverse, or what it means to be inclusive. So why them? Why this? Why now? When I became head of department, we had a really good curriculum, but it wasn't inclusive and it wasn't anti-racist. So I spent that year deciding that I wanted to make that happen. And that involved working long hours. It involved having really difficult conversations with staff and students to figure out what we had not been doing and what we needed to do. And then once I'd finished that work, when we were rolling it out, I was very clear on the people who also were designing the schemes of work alongside me that we're not just doing this to tick a box. If the students say this doesn't speak to me or this makes me feel uncomfortable, that is valuable information, and we want them to be part of it. I think when I ask their opinions, like, did it work? Or in their words, did it bang? And they say to me, it did, or it didn't bang, miss, it didn't bang, miss, don't do that again. You have to, you take it on board and you move forward and then you include them. And I think that in terms of with parents, you have to understand that the effects of colonialism are very far reaching. Parents value Shakespeare above all else, actually. They want their children to know Shakespeare, but we also want their children to know Shakespeare. We want their children to know Shakespeare and lots of other stories as well. So I think because we begin with the students go home and report back on English. They say, we love English. We really like our teacher. We really like what they're doing in English. They're trying to do this, mum. They're trying to do this, dad. And I think that buy-in that happens at home allows us to have intentional and critical conversations with the parents, but we're also having to broaden their expectations about what their children learn. But because students are at the heart of it, they teach me, I teach them, and there's this beautiful exchange of energy and information in the classroom because of that.
That's I think it's just really encouraging to hear. Now, I also thought when you were talking there, Joy, just about this opportunity to share with colleagues, and how, as teachers, the three of you in different positions within your schools and what have you, really just how you use that agency to really spread this so that students can have these conversations across classrooms, in the playground, that it isn't just something that's happening in your class. So I'm just going to throw that out to all of you, really, to think about, like, how you really spread the love. Jessica, go on, share. Tell me.
I'll go. I think it depends on your role in the school, in all honesty. Like, I can speak from my experience that so I'm 2IC, the English department, but I'm in charge of Key Stage 3 English. So it would be that, I guess, working department wide to make sure that as a department, we have a shared goal. And like I said earlier, if I am saying, we're going to teach this text now, this is going to be on our curriculum, as Joy said earlier, why are we adding that text on the curriculum? What do we need to prioritize in our teaching approaches when we're teaching this text? And just being really, I think a lot of what we do as teachers, how do I put it, is that you really prepare and you really plan ahead and you really do your homework. But in the classroom, the students can't tell that. It all feels very organic and it feels like you've just thrown it together, seeing how it goes. And obviously that's why English teaching is beautiful. So I think it's just finding that balance. To give just one really brief example, a couple of years ago, I decided that as an English department, we would stop teaching Of Mice and Men in Year 8, and instead we would teach Minty Alley by C.L.R. James, which, if anyone does want to teach it, there's some really, really good resources for it on the LiT in Colour website as well. And just a couple of things that I did when we were teaching that to make sure it was joyful and that students enjoyed it, and to come back to that word, that students felt safe when they were learning it. I created, because it was quite a long book, I created a booklet of extracts, and I made sure that each extract, where necessary, had trigger warnings. I made sure those were on the lesson plans. I made sure, as I briefly mentioned earlier, that the teachers who were going to be teaching that book were aware of that and why we were doing that and how to approach that. So I think it's just planning ahead, I would say, to make sure that the actual lessons themselves can be as fruitful and joyful as possible. So doing the work ahead of time to allow that to happen.
Anyone else want to come in on that? It's just
Sure.
that thing of, like using your power and, your knowledge to really infuse and share across the department. This is something that I'm often asked in terms of like, so that it isn't just a resource that, is just, going to be in your classroom, that it is shared across departments. And I know lots of departments do work like that and beyond as well, so I'm, in my work in terms of advisory and consultancy work, I get to do that a lot, but much of that starts from what you do as a teacher within your school. So
Sure. So I think that I don't want NQTs and classroom teachers new to the classroom to be discouraged. There is power that you have in the classroom. I think
mm,
children are very powerful in terms of spreading what you do. So if you commit, even if it's small change, even if it can't be the change that you would like to see eventually, having those kind of moments where you speak about, if you are still teaching of mice of men, what Crooks goes through and why he perpetuates the very system that oppresses him, and teaching from a place of great empathy, your children will carry that. Their feet are faster than yours and quicker than yours. They will carry that around the school. I think for me, as I moved, I guess, through the ranks as a 2IC, as I mentioned, when George Floyd was murdered, I did create lessons that kind of spoke about privilege and what it meant. When I was appointed as head of department, one of the questions that I did ask in interview to the people who were going to join my team was, what was your personal and professional response to this moment that essentially stopped the world? And the basis of their appointment, alongside their teaching, alongside how students responded to them, was what they did as well. Because I need to make sure that when I'm bringing you into this classroom, you are not going to cause harm to these children. If you don't care about what happened, that is fine. But that means that you don't really care about what's going to be happening to these children in this classroom, because their lives are mirrors. There are so many parallels between their lives and what happens to them on the streets of London, unfortunately. I think running training as well, and making sure that whenever I would attend training as head of department, so if there was free training available, I would go. I would invite other people to come alongside me. I would then run training to make sure that this information was being disseminated. And as assistant head teacher in this new role, I'm really thinking about student leadership and making sure that we have opportunities for students to go and do that training and bring it back to the school. So I think at every level you can create change, and I don't want anyone to feel discouraged, because I know that definitely I thought, when I become, head of department, and it doesn't. You don't have to wait until then. There are going to be moments where you can read the text in a different way. I think everybody's spoken about the reading that you can do, and if you are making those changes inwardly, you are going to begin to ask those questions off the back of your reading. You take that to your department, and you just keep like kind of plodding along, keep kind of like banging on the door and saying, this is what I think, this is what I think. And eventually, even if it's just to keep you quiet, they'll give you something.
yeah, definitely. I'm going to just move us over now to our Q&A, because we have quite a few questions that have been posed. So I'm just going to kind of just go through them and throw. I won't ask all of you to input on every question, but if you really feel that you want to dive in, please do. And if we have that kind of pregnant pause, then I will just pick on you, okay? And then you can bounce it back. Right, so the first one, which is quite interesting actually, because I do remember teaching this. A teacher has said they are apprehensive about teaching Beloved with its bleak and traumatic themes. So do any of the panelists have advice for her? And I'm just going to quickly come in before any of you do, if you have used this. One of the things that I didn't teach the whole text, but I remember teaching, a long time ago, you'd go into these stock cupboards and you'd have some really odd books. Okay. And one of the things that everybody used to love teaching was this book called Underground to Canada. And it was about these two girls who didn't want to be slaves anymore, so they ran away. Very, very simplistic. But what you can do with all of that as a teacher is just, immense. And what I got these kids to dig into was, yes, this is very simplistic, and there's this horrible theme of slavery, and it's you know, kind of just that you don't want to be a slave anymore, you can just run off. And one of the things I did was compare it to an extract from Beloved. Now these were only year eights, so it was an extract that really showed that part where, you know, she can't think of anything worse than her baby having to grow up as a slave, and she, you know, she unalives her baby. And what that did for those kids was that it made them have that contrast, and for them to be able to see those differences between what is the reality and how you can be introduced to the reality through something more simplistic, be able to take it somewhere else, and for those kids to go off and want to read that themselves. So I think there are, you know, there are different ways that you can enter into something that is quite heavy, and I'll just throw that over to you all if any of you want to just come in on that. No, no. Do you think I've said enough there? Do you? All right, I've got one on of mice and men, and I know obviously we're all getting a sight of these questions. So Joy, I'm going to throw this at you. A teacher has asked, what are the main issues with teaching of mice and men?
Sure. So I read of Mice and Men when I was a teaching assistant. So I read it later than everybody else. I think my year group, we read To Kill a Mockingbird. So I'd missed of Mice and Men. And I remember sitting in the classroom. I would have been maybe about 22 at the time. And I remember reading ahead because I was like, this text is amazing. Wow. And then George, Lenny, I couldn't believe the ending, right? I was heartbroken. So I actually couldn't wait to teach it, right? When I got into the classroom. But then, as I was reading the text, as when I was a bit older and I was having to teach it, I realized that Curly's wife didn't have a name. Lenny is, we think he's disabled, but is he disabled? Not really told. And then Crooks's ending is Crooks doesn't really have an Crooks doesn't have a name and like an ending. He's like he's also has a disability, but he's also kind of like he's treated really badly. He's used the N word is used to describe him throughout the book. And the question I had to ask myself is, yes, the text is about immigration and belonging and about this dream, but what else is being communicated to my students? What is it saying about what it means to be a woman? You know, red, all the, you know, the connotations of red and Curly's wife and women, and what happens to her is very, very dark. What happens to Lenny is also dark. There is more that happens in the text that is bad to the characters than is good, if we're going to be honest. And in a space, in the time we're in now, we have to be very careful when our students are being exposed. I don't know if any of you have been on TikTok, but people actually just go on there and just talk. They just put the camera on, they just speak, and our students are consuming this at an alarming rate. They spend hours. I'm speaking during lockdown. Some of them said my students reported that they were spending 18 hours a day on their phones, and so we have to really be careful about what we are contributing to the conversation. Are we moving the conversation forward? And I think at times, as an English classroom, our conversations are very much in the past. What are we saying about Curly's wife? What are we saying about women? Unless you are framing the text and saying, actually, I'm going to treat this text as a kind of like a springboard for activism. So we're going to speak about women's rights. We're going to speak about the rights of people who are not considered able. We're going to speak about the rights of like Black people. Unless you're doing it like that is, I would say, go for it, because I think that it's a meaty text to get into. But if you make it about the American dream and what it means to belong, they don't belong, and they're rejected by their society, and two of them die. I think as a society, as a school and as a society, we've moved on from a place where that is the end of the story. If you want to continue the narrative, continue in a way that empowers our students, doesn't leave them with more questions than answers. And I think that is why personally I decided not to teach of Mice and Men to my students moving forward.
Okay, that's interesting. I've got another question here that just talks really about asks about the use of the N word in older texts like of Mice and Men and Roll of Thunder. and what approaches you all might use in the classroom when you come across negative language. Aisha?
Yeah, actually, that's something that Mice and Men is a text that I've taught before as well. And there's always a lesson on about the issue with the M word. There's always a lesson that I've done before we read. I think it first mentioned in chapter 2. Before we get to that chapter about the M word, there's a brilliant. I think it is a BBC article actually. So I think one of the things when we talked about resources is find good resources that are really reliable. The BBC tends to be really good. Those sorts of resources are quite good actually to use for teaching. There's lots of BBC Teach resources that are really strong on these areas that really are very clear. So there's a BBC article called the History of the M Word that I always use with students, and we read it together, and then I get them to answer a couple of questions. And essentially, it kind of gives them a bit of a potted history of the use of it. So origins of slavery, the reclaiming of it, maybe in the 20th century, the use of it by rappers, and what So it's really kind of, they find it really engaging and interesting. So that's a great baseline. So I'd recommend that. I think if you just type in BBC, the history of the M word, it'll come up, and it's a very accessible article. So that's one resource I would say that I would use. That's a great approach with it. I've always had with students just an agreement that we obviously don't say it. So when we've read of Mice and Men, it's actually always been quite powerful. Students like to read aloud, so they'll read section chapters. When they come to it, they'll either just pause, some of them replace it with black, some of them just say M word. So, and actually it's been, whenever there's just been like a pause, that's actually been quite powerful, I think. So there's different ways, but I would say, yeah, we've always agreed, or we've always set that ground rule that we won't say it. This word is in the book, we won't say it. And actually, it's funny because I'm planning at the minute to teach this, and the M word's actually in this as well. So punch in the air. So that's one that I'm planning to teach in the coming term. So it still exists even in, I suppose, more modern texts, including those older ones as well. So it's just something to think about. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to just there's loads of questions. It's really good. So here's another one. Do any of the panel have any suggestions on approaching all white classrooms with these themes? Can any of you throw any light on that? I'll quickly just come in and say, I mean, I've worked at the beginning of the 2000s. I went to work as an advisor in Thurrock, which at the time was a very monocultural area, and over the years it's changed. And I do think that there was a lot of work to do with teachers in terms of introducing more cultural texts, being more on point with the texts that were already in the curriculum, things at GCSE and so on and so forth. And I do think one of the most important things that we did was to talk about, to have the space to actually talk and to share about those things. And I was often the only Black person in that space, and my main aim is I want honesty. Really, I want honesty, and I'm not going to be apologetic about sharing my ideas or the things that I think that young people need to know and be exposed to, in the way that everyone has an opinion and ideas that they want to share, and is within a framework of a curriculum and so on and so forth. So that would be where I come from, but I would love to hear any advice that you have to share on that. And I know, Joy, you touched on this about how important it is, regardless of whether it's a mixed group, or it is just monocultural, what have you. So please come in there.
Sure. I think we have to understand that racism is a really bad word. It's really stigmatized, and people are often offended. I think, as a Black person, I don't know when I became aware that I was Black. I don't know that moment. I can't remember. But I do remember reading the noughts and crosses and thinking, oh my goodness, she is like me, and I have not seen this before. So perhaps it was then. I was probably about 10. I remember running around the playground with a hood on my head my coat on my head to try and make my hair long. So I think I was aware that my hair didn't flow in the way that other people's. I guess I'm using this to demonstrate that my awareness of my blackness is just always been there. Whereas I think white people often aren't confronted with the reality that they are white. It's only when it's in kind of relation to somebody else and they're saying, oh, you've done something to me, or this is happening in the world and it's because of race. And if race has never been an issue to you, you just can't understand why it's ridiculous. Why would somebody judge you on the basis of your skin? You can't control that. It is ridiculous, but it is real and it does happen. And I think that the first thing in my head, just kind of quickly going through, I think with pushback, you will face pushback from the parents. That is I think that's inevitable because they think it's rude to talk about racism, and they do not think that school should be politicized, even though they are, right? But they're very against it. So I think that one thing that I would try and do is lead with empathy. I would choose a text. I know noughts and crosses is spoken about a lot, but I think texts like that, texts that really invite conversations around what it means to be different, to live in a world where you are judged for things that you cannot control. And this doesn't have to be limited to race. I think in those kind of schools, there needs to be, I think the leaders of the curriculum need to sit down and say, okay, what do we want our children, what world do we want our children to live in? What do we want them to speak to when they leave these doors? And that is the place, I think that's the place that we start, because it can't just happen in English in such schools. It has to be across the school. The curriculum leaders need to be on board and have to be doing that thinking and that reading and that learning for this to take place. If it's not happening at the top, then it's not really going to work. I think an individual teacher would really crumble in the face of a parent saying, "You are what are you doing to my child?" So I think in terms of what I would do is I would start to kind of petition and start to speak to the leaders and start to have those conversations and say, okay, as a school, this is the world we live in. This is what we want our students to be, but this is what we're teaching them, and we are ignoring them. What can we do? And if you can galvanize the people in your department, the people across departments, and the school have a mission, and that changes, I think that is awareness. That's big, but because of what I assume the pushback would be, I think it has to start in that place for it to be successful.
Thank you. Some other questions that we have is about parents and just really in regards to have you experienced any pushback from parents? Because I mean, there's a lot. We're seeing quite a lot in the media about varying different aspects of life issues, critical race theory, things like that, and how these things enter into our teaching, really. And so someone's just really keen to find out really what pushback you might have got from parents and how you've dealt with that, or your school has dealt with that.
Can I comment here just briefly?
Yeah.
We did have a bit of pushback when we started teaching Lindsay Alley, just because I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but it's a really interesting book because it's about so many things, but there is like an undercurrent of colorism, of racism in the book. So we did receive, I guess, questions from some parents about why we were getting rid of mice and men, etc. And I think I just come back to what I said earlier about making sure that your department has a shared goal for why you are teaching that text, because it might be that I've created that scheme of work, say I've made that decision to teach that text across the department. It might be that I'm not the one getting the pushback from the parent in the first instance. So making sure that every single teacher in the department knows why that text is being taught, why it's special. As Joyce said earlier, like, why are we teaching this right now? Why are we teaching this in this way to these students? And if you are a teacher and you're, I guess, on the other side of that and you're being told, okay, we're going to be teaching this text now, ask the question, why are we teaching this text? What's special about this book? because I want to be able to communicate that to students. So no matter what role you're in, you can ask those questions and you can make sure that in yourself you are confident on why that choice is being made.
Thank you. I'm going to roll these two questions into two, and I'm just conscious that we're getting towards our sort of time now. But here's sort of two questions. How can white teachers understand the issues for readers of colour with the text? But also, I thought I'd throw in this, what does calling in rather than calling out mean in practice? And what do you need to do this effectively in the moment? So you can answer either side of that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I don't
What
mind
was the
speaking.
first half of the question?
So
Yeah,
the first
could you
half
repeat
of,
the first
Yeah.
one?
yeah,
Sorry.
the first half of the
Apologies.
question is, how can white teachers understand the issues for readers of colour with the text? And then the second bit was about what does calling in rather than calling out mean in practice? And I think I have an answer to that one, but I'd really like to hear what you think on that.
I think that white teachers have to be aware and how can I say, accept that there are certain aspects of this experience that they'll never understand. But that is okay. It's okay that there are certain words that you cannot say, and there's certain aspects of my life that you won't understand. That doesn't mean that you cannot extend empathy, right? It doesn't mean because I have never experienced it, therefore, I just, it's off limits and it's very scary. It doesn't have to mean that. It means that I cannot speak to what it means to be a Muslim woman. I cannot speak to what it means to be in a wheelchair. There are certain aspects of life, and when that conversation is arising, I give space for other people to begin to speak. When people say the voice of the voiceless, you shouldn't be the voice for the voiceless, because the voiceless, they tend to have words. We just need to give them space to be able to use them. And so it's about acknowledging the privileges that you have, which I think is fundamental and something that I encourage. I've done in my own classroom, because I speak to my students. I say, I have class privilege. I do. And it means there's certain aspects of your experience that I haven't lived. And so I invite you to tell me what it means to live in this way. And I'm not the authority. I think it's about creating space and leading with empathy. Creating space, and then you lead with empathy. What do you think about this? Doing the reading, doing the work, and saying, who has experienced this? Or finding articles about people who have experienced it and being like, I can't imagine what it means to live in this person's shoes. What do you think? And we can build a really magical world in the classroom when we lead from a place of empathy, because some of our students haven't experienced it. But when we build empathetic students, we create adults who go into workplaces, and if their subordinates are not, the people they're line managing are not performing well, they lead with empathy. I think it's far reaching if we can teach people, even if I don't look like you, even if I don't experience what you experience, I still do my best to understand and show you grace. And I think that is what I would invite white teachers who are a bit cautious to do, as opposed to kind of being afraid. It's not. I don't want you to be fearful. I want you to be bold. I want you to be brave, and I want you to be empathetic, because that is more powerful than you having the words that you feel that you're missing. I hope that makes sense.
It really does. And just if anyone else wants to come in there very briefly.
Yeah, I will just really, really quickly. I think just Joy has already said it, but I think she's mentioned, like, doing the reading. And one book actually that I would really recommend for whoever has asked that question is I Heard What You Said by Jeffrey Bratchy. If you haven't read that, I think I'd recommend it to everyone here anyway. It's incredibly insightful, incredibly validating. So he is an educator. He's written a few YA books actually, which I've used in the classroom before. And he's Black male English teacher, that very, very rarest of, I think, we don't have many men actually in English teaching, I think. And actually, being a Black male English teacher, in his experience, it's kind of part autobiography, a little bit about pedagogy, but it's so interesting. Essentially, the tagline is a Black teacher, a white system. It's really, really just a brilliant read, and that will really give you an insight into the I suppose from that aspect of being as a white teacher, how can you understand from that perspective? So I'd read that.
Look, thank you, so much. We've come to an end. I just want to thank our panelists, Jessica, Joy, and Aisha, and to you all in the audience for this fantastic, really rich discussion. So we're now going to head to a short break. Please don't forget to scan the QR codes and secure your book bundles or something like that before we have the next session with Leslie Nelson Addy in conversation with Bernadine Evaristo about her award-winning novel, Girl, Woman, Other. Thank you so much.